Hello, doctors. I'm Dr. Chris Rapoff of DC QME Continuing Education, and welcome to this week's case law update. In today's case, we have one where the applicant's treating physician concluded that the patient's industrial injury to her head actually had hastened the growth of a brain tumor, thereby concluding that the presence of the brain tumor was industrial. Now, what do you think the neurological QME had to say about this? More importantly, what did the Work Comp Appeals Board rule in this fascinating case? You just may be surprised. Now, today we have a defendant that is seeking reconsideration of a findings and award issued by the workers' compensation judge. And this judge found, in pertinent part, that Ms. Duran's head contusion accelerated her brain cancer. And the cancer constitutes an injury that arising out of and occurring in the course of her employment. Now, the defendant contended that the reports and the deposition testimony of Ms. Duran's treating physician were not substantial medical evidence upon which a decision could be based. Let's take a look. Now, for some background, the applicant, who's Ms. Duran, claimed that she had an injury in the form of a head contusion that resulted in brain cancer while she was employed by the defendant as an accountant clerk in 2020. Ms. Duran underwent a course of treatment from various providers at University of California, San Diego Health, and including a treating physician who was a neurosurgeon. Now, also a neurology qualified medical evaluator evaluated Ms. Duran after examining her, and he took a history and reviewing the medical record. He diagnosed her as having a contusion of the scalp as an initial encounter, and also as it had a neoplasm of uncertain behavior of meninges, and it was unspecified. Now, regarding the cause of Ms. Duran's condition, the QME continued. He indicated that it was based on the currently available information, including the patient's self-reported history of the injury, that her symptomatology, as well as his findings on examination, it was his medical opinion that only the patient's current symptoms and objective findings related to the left parietal scalp contusion were a direct result of the industrial injury in 2020. He also stated that it was his medical opinion that none of the patient's current symptoms and objective findings related to a scalp, skull, or dural mass or a cancerous tumor are a direct result of the industrial injury in November of 2020. Now, if you ask me, in my opinion, it was a pretty convincing statement made by the neuro QME. As for her ongoing treatment for the effects of this rapidly growing tumor, Ms. Duran's neuro MD requested and received authorization for a surgical procedure which involved the placement of a right ventriculoperitoneal shunt, basically a tube placed in the brain to drain fluid. This was also performed with image guidance. Now, interestingly enough, the utilization review approved this procedure, and her doctor performed the cerebral shunt placement. Now, during his testimony, her neurologist indicated that what his specialties were, and he testified and provided an extensive list of credentials. He stated that he attended medical school at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, completed a neurosurgery residency at the University of California, San Diego. He had a fellowship in endovascular neurosurgery and a subspecialty training with neurosurgery in vascular, endovascular, and complex cranial issues. Now, I think you'll agree that these are some very, very impressive credentials presented by her neurologist. Well, the next several slides are actually taken from Mr. Duran's treating neurologist as he provided his testimony regarding the cause of Ms. Duran's cancer. I think you'll find this Q&A quite interesting. So first of all, the attorney asks, well, can head trauma or impact the growth of those cells and then result in a tumor? The neurologist reported that, yes, it has been reported in the medical literature. So the attorney continues, so are there cases or research that supports the theory that trauma to the head can accelerate a pre-existing growth? And he answered, well, it's been reported in the medical literature. And again, here, the attorney asks, so did the falling of the shelf landing on her head, it didn't cause the tumor, right? Neurologist responded by saying, well, it's my opinion that the trauma did not cause the tumor. It's my opinion that the shelf striking her head may have caused the rapid growth and the presentation that she presented to my clinic, which was in agreement with what had been described in some of the cases in the literature. So it was not the actual cause, but it contributed to. The questions continue, and the attorney asks, well, would you say that the trauma of the shelf falling on her head accelerated the growth of the meningioma? And the neurologist said, well, based on the patient's history and the case reports in the literature, I would say that that's medically probable. Not possible, but probable. So the attorney then responds with a question. So you can state within reasonable medical probability that the shelf falling and landing on her head at work accelerated the meningioma? And the neurologist responded with, yes, that is correct. Finally, the attorney says, well, the acceleration is at least 1% or more. Is that accurate? And neurologist says, yes, that is accurate. So here we are. We've set up a substantial medical evidence answer here that is basically a qualified answer. So it sounds as if the attorney might have been a bit surprised by his last answer, the neurologist's answer. So he responds by asking, well, when you're reaching this conclusion that the head trauma that she suffered at work, specifically the shelf falling and landing on her head, when you reach the conclusion that the trauma accelerated the meningioma within medical probability, what were you basing your opinion on? Neurologist responded, well, I had two pieces of evidence. Number one, the patient's history of illness. I find her to be reliable, and the patient clearly stated to me that she did not have this lesion prior to the shelf hitting her head, and then very soon, within 2 weeks of the shelf hitting her head, she had a rapid and sustained growth. And number two, it has been described in the literature that there are case reports in association between head trauma and the presentation of these primary extradural meningiomas. So the attorney continues. He says, you're saying something about the tumor. And the neurologist says, well, yes, it extends into the vertex, so the top of the skull. So I would say that the tumor, if I were to classify it, was eccentric to the left, but included the top of the head as shown by my radiology colleagues. And the attorney then just asks, so the shelf either impacting more of the top or the left of her head is consistent with your assessment of the growth of the tumor and that the trauma contributed and accelerated the tumor? Is that what you're saying? Is that correct? And treating neurologist says, yes, that is correct. The neurology QME responded via a supplemental report, and he was actually addressing and rebutting the treating physician's testimony regarding the actual injury. And it's pretty emphatic, so I stated this in quotes. He stated, I previously commented that the patient was diagnosed with an anaplastic meningioma, which is a World Health Organization grade 3 intracranial cranial tumor. This lesion contains anaplastic, or essentially pre-malignant cells that can very easily undergo a malignant transformation if not properly treated. The fact that the patient suffered a scalp contusion, essentially over the area where the mass had been developing, is purely coincidental. The scalp contusion in no way led to this lesion arising or progressing. And the fact that the lesion progressed so rapidly following the date of the injury emphasizes the aggressiveness of this lesion and has virtually nothing to do with the scalp contusion itself. The scalp, skull, dural mass is purely non-industrial. The specific injury suffered by the patient is a scalp contusion which has resolved, period. So the parties proceeded to trial, and the issues submitted for the decision included the body part that was injured, and the big question was the applicant's cancer caused or accelerated by the accepted workers' compensation injury, which was a contusion to the scalp. So they actually began their decision and their discussion with a definition of substantial medical evidence, We know it, but I will state it again. It's any award, order, or decision of the appeals board must be supported by substantial evidence. To be substantial evidence, a medical opinion must be based on pertinent facts, on an adequate exam, and it must be set forth the basis and the reasoning in support of the conclusions. It's interesting here what they also stated, that medical evidence that industrial injury was reasonably probable, although not certain, constitutes substantial evidence for a finding of an injury, AOE, COE. So you can see where they're leaning here. The appeals board also recognized the workers' compensation judge in his report, and they stated, well, the treating neurologist is a neurosurgeon with a fellowship in endovascular neurosurgery and subspecialty training in vascular, endovascular, and complex cranial issues. He was a treating and diagnosing physician for Ms. Duran. Also of the treating neurologist, they disagreed with the neurology PQME that the head injury was at the site of the tumor presented. He also opined definitively that the tumor developed at the site of the head trauma and its growth was accelerated by the head trauma itself. So the appeals board reached a decision and they stated that they actually did agree with the workers' compensation judge and that by the deposition testimony of Ms. Duran's treating neurosurgeon, he provided a detailed and well-reasoned explanation for his opinion that the shelf impacting Ms. Duran's head was consistent with the assessment of the growth of the tumor, and that the physical trauma of the impact contributed to and accelerated the growth of the tumor. Additionally, they stated that it was established that the relevant and considered opinion of one physician, though inconsistent with another medical opinion, may constitute substantial evidence, and the appeals board may rely on the medical opinion of one single physician unless it's based on surmise, speculation, conjecture, or guess. And then they finally stated that having reviewed the deposition testimony, it was actually clear that Mr. Duran's treating neurosurgeon's medical opinion was not the result of surmise, speculation, conjecture, or guess, and that his opinions that were explained by his testimony constituted substantial medical evidence, and they were appropriate basis for the initial judge's decision that Mrs. Duran's head contusion had accelerated her brain cancer, and based that the cancer constitutes an injury, AOE, COE. Therefore, they accordingly denied reconsideration request by the defendant. It was a fascinating case. Now, here we have two very well respected neurosurgeons with opposing opinions regarding causation of an industrial injury. And we find that an opinion sometimes is neither right or wrong, but it really depends on what the opinion was most convincing and which really depends on what the opinion was most convincing and which one was more persuasive. And this time the appeals board felt that it was Mr. Rand's side that presented the best case. Why? Well, because the opinions and conclusions made by her neurosurgeon were more convincing. And that the opinion qualified as substantial medical evidence. Interesting. So once again, doctors, I'm Dr. Chris Rapoff, and I wanted to thank you for taking the time to join me in today's presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I do look forward to sharing some other very interesting cases again with you real soon. Until then, take care.